We need workers. We need great workers. And this pretty much ensures that that's what's going to happen. I think, Sean, do you agree with that?
Well, they're $100,000 per year.
Per year.
So the whole idea is no more will these big tech companies or other big companies train foreign workers. If you're going to train somebody, you're going to train one of the recent graduates from one of the great universities across our land. Train Americans, stop bringing in people to take our jobs. That's the policy here, $100,000 a year.
A year!
H-1B visas, and all of the big companies are on board.
And I think he repeats the per year thing a couple more times. And then they have to walk it back. Carolyn Levitt has to walk it back. This is not an annual fee. Donald, it's a bad look. Those who already hold H-1B visas and are currently outside the country right now will not be charged $100,000 to re-enter. That's such a shame. I was loving that panic. Talk about sucking all the air out of the room. And this is the kind of response Trump got, and appropriately so. The Trump walkback on H-1B is unforgivable. The program is an existential threat to future generations of Americans. I agree. Trump appears to be captured by corporate interests who care only about profit, even if the result is that citizens will end up as serfs to foreigners in their own country. Huge betrayal. It's a problem. Donald's going to have to address this. Not Trump's best performance, I say as a Trump supporter myself, but it did have the benefit of triggering an explosion of H-1B discussion on social media, including really exposing how Indians think about America, think about H-1Bs, and exposing the degree to which they are so aggressively exploiting our great nation for their own benefit. The big headlines, of course, were that Trump was going to impose a $100,000 fee on H-1Bs that, at least initially, was supposed to apply every year to all of them. Foreign, domestic, everybody was going to have to pay a $100,000 fee to get an H-1B visa in the United States, which, of course, would effectively obliterate the program. And this part seems to still be in effect. They were going to reset kind of the minimum wage for H-1Bs. The lower that wage, and I think right now it's about $50,000, $60,000 a year, the more often we're bringing in H-1Bs from India who are just, midwits, mid-tier people, not the best and brightest. The higher the minimum wage we set, well, then the higher quality person, in theory, that we're getting. I'd like to see it set to $1 million a year. That would be nice. But Trump apparently would be bumping it up from about 50 or 60 to 100 or 50 or 60, which is a good first step. But unfortunately, the walkback is, it's going to lead to certainly political repercussions for Trump. People are very, very unhappy about this stuff being walked back. I am certainly very unhappy about it. Began to see a lot of this stuff. I want to be extremely clear in case anyone in the White House sees this. The reason Americans were so excited about the H-1B proclamation because of what was said on the Oval Office stream while Trump was signing it. That the $100,000 fee was yearly, that it would apply to current visa holders, all that stuff. That's what people care about. That's what got people excited. That is what made people rejoice for the future of America. That is what made people celebrate. I understand that politics is a balancing act, but in this case, the weight is all on one item. And one thing you can't do in politics or business, and President Trump ought to know this, is overpromise and underdeliver. And this sure looks like an underdeliver. Within 24 hours, Customs and Border Patrol, not sure actually why they're even involved in this. They're not really in the chain of command for this kind of stuff. But they posted, let's set the record straight. Trump's updated H-1B visa requirement applies only to new prospective H-1B petitions that have not yet been filed, which is kind of weird because the annual process for this just ended, and the proclamation's only good for a year moving forward. So who exactly would be caught up in this? But in any case, petitions submitted prior to September 21st, 2025 are not affected. Any reports claiming otherwise are flat out wrong and should be ignored. Carolyn Levitt, the press secretary for the White House, this is not an annual fee. It's a one-time fee that applies only to the petition. Well, that's a little awkward because Lutnick in the Oval Office looks right in the camera. It reminded me of the Bill Clinton. I mean, in hindsight, it reminds me of the Bill Clinton waving his finger at the camera saying, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. I mean, it's not quite as bad as that, but it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And Lutnick says, standing next to Trump, that this is an annual fee. He says it repeatedly. And that, my friends, is not cool.
We need workers. We need great workers. And this pretty much ensures that that's what's going to happen. I think, Sean, do you agree with that?
Well, they're $100,000 per year.
Per year.
So the whole idea is no more will these big tech companies or other big companies train foreign workers. They have to pay the government $100,000, then they have to pay the employee. So it's just not economic. If you're going to train somebody, you're going to train one of the recent graduates from one of the great universities across our land. Train Americans, stop bringing in people to take our jobs. That's the policy here, $100,000 a year.
A year!
H1-B visas, and all of the big companies are on board. We've spoken to them about the gold card.
They love it. They love it. They really love it. They need.
Those who already hold H-1B visas and are currently outside the country right now will not be charged $100,000 to re-enter. That's such a shame. I was loving that panic. I was loving the panic. This applies only to new visas, not renewals, and not current visa holders. So, I mean, talk about sucking all the air out of the room. And now people are unsatisfied. They were ecstatic about what was proposed, $100,000 a year. Now that's not enough. That's not enough anymore. Not after this walk back. We don't want the 100,000 feet per year anymore. We demand outright cancellation of the H-1B visa program. It's a scam that steals from Americans. Now, of course, you can always take the position that, hey, you got to do things a step at a time. Well, fair enough. This guy makes that argument. People complaining the H-1B executive order doesn't apply to existing H-1Bs should remember, 1, not yet. 2, this is the first big step, much more to come. 3, maintain a mindset of optimism, gratitude, relentless persistence. And 4, we are going to win. That could all be true. And you still effed up the messaging, Trump. If this is the approach you want to take, then that's the approach you take. You don't do this yet. You don't promise this yet, 100,000 fee a year. You don't pretend you're taking a giant step forward and then it turns out to be a baby step. You can't be disappointing people like that. More clarification from the White House. People leaving the country or visiting India, they don't want to rush. They don't have to rush back before Sunday and then be required to pay the $100,000 fee if they don't make it. That was too bad. By the way, I have good reason to believe that there are many, many Indians who secure an H-1B visa in the United States, get hired by an American company, get paid an American wage, and it's a remote type job where they're supposed to be in America, but they actually go back to India. They're living in India, securing that American salary. So they're getting paid in American dollars at an American rate, living in India like kings. They're never in America. Those were the people who were most panicking, not the people who happened to be in India on vacation or their mother was sick or they were there for a wedding. It's people who've been living in India while supposedly working in the U.S. under an H-1B. Those were the ones who were panicked. They were like, holy crap, I've got to come back to the U.S. within 24 hours. Now, that was the $100,000 a year fee, the having to rush back thing. That all got walked back, which is too bad. The bumping of the minimum salary looks like it's still in place, and that is a big deal. That makes it much more difficult to bring in the hundreds of thousands of 50,000, 60,000 midwits from India who are not the best and brightest, who are just obviously taking American jobs. If you raise the minimum age, if suddenly companies have to pay those people $150,000 a year, it becomes uneconomic to bring them in. Prevailing wage part, that's what we're talking about here. That looks like it's still in effect, so that's good. And this guy notes, for people complaining about the prevailing wage bump, he says if H-1B was really about getting the best talent on earth, they'd have no problem with the floor wage being raised in alignment with India. India has its own version of H-1B. Did you know that? That India has an H-1B too. If someone wants to migrate to India, they can get India's equivalent of an H-1B visa, go work there. But to do that, the company hiring them in India has to pay them 10 times the wage that an Indian would get for the same job. Why can't America do that? I think that's a good idea. By the way, we don't even really pretend we're getting the best and brightest because the H-1Bs are handed out on a lottery system. There's no ranking of H-1B applications. for competence or productivity or expertise. There's a pool of 85,000 people, many of whom are volleyball instructors, pickleball instructors, nannies, and they just get randomized and then randomly awarded H1-B visas to come work in the US. That's not picking the best talent on earth. We could have a different system. We could have a compensation ranking system. We could have an academic credential system, but of course the Indians all faked their academic credentials. But we could at least rank them by what American companies are willing to pay for them. So if someone's worth $1 million to an American company, all right, that guy's at the top of the compensation rank list. He gets in, he gets a visa. And then $500,000 and then 200,000 or whatever. But the people who are in America on H1B visas doing mid-level coding for 50 grand a year, they're at the bottom of the list and they're not going to get awarded an H1B visa. That seems like a reasonable approach to me. That was the proclamation, the walk back of the proclamation, and the consequences of that, the recoiling feedback of Americans to that. Now, I mentioned earlier that I don't think it's unreasonable to view how India is using its H1B program as a sort of bioweapon. And not just to the US. Of course, my concern is only to the US, but this happens to be a classroom in an Australian school. Can you see the picture? It's almost exclusively Indian students in Australia. India has a major cultural problem, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, but because of this cultural problem, India is literally compelled to export many of its more productive classes, which are not highly productive by Western standards, but are productive by Indian standards. They have to export them from India to Western nations for two reasons. Those people cannot achieve success within India because India is throttling itself with an unbelievably expansive DEI program that rewards non-performers over even mid-wit performers. So even the Indian mid-wit performers have no opportunity in India because it's all handed down to the non-performers. And India its entire economy is dependent upon the remittances it gets from its citizens who it exports to other nations and then send the cash back to India. From the U.S. alone, Indian migrants in the U.S. send $130 billion a year back to India. That's more than twice. Actually, it's 140 now. That's more than twice what is sent to Mexico. We think about remittances. We normally think about Mexico. Mexico's about 60 billion. 140 billion US dollars are sent to India every year from Indian migrants in America. The Indian government would collapse without that money. So the Indian nation is compelled to export its citizens to Western civilization for those reasons. And it acts like a kind of bioweapon because no society, no Western society, even America, right? The largest Western society, 300 plus million people. India could send us a third of their population of 1.5 billion, and it would still exceed the entire American population. No Western civilization can absorb this kind of bioweapon and still be the nation it was. America can't absorb 400 million Indians and still be America. It can't absorb a fraction of that number, which is a problem we'll talk about in more. And of course, the reality is that this is all just a labor wage arbitration opportunity by American companies and by Indian consultancies who can make billions of dollars off of this. The largest sponsors of H1B visas are companies that are simply reselling the labor. These are the Indian consultancies. They bring in an Indian, they sell them to an American company for X dollars, X number of dollars an hour, and they recoup a fraction of that expense. And you do that hundreds of thousands of times, and you get to make a good income. Look at the incomes of these companies. This guy writes, Trump just obliterated, this is on Friday when the proclamation was first made, Trump just obliterated several multi-billion-dollar Indian staffing companies. Many H-1B workers are hired via IT consulting and contracting companies, not directly by businesses. And these companies have big market caps. Cognizant, 34 billion. Infosys, 70 billion. Tata Consulting, 130 billion. Can I ask why America needs there to exist companies with billion-dollar market caps, sometimes triple-digit billion-dollar market caps, for the purpose of importing labor to undercut American workers? Why do we even allow this to exist? It's representative of the scale of the problem. These consultancies represent 70% of H-1Bs, and they are used de facto fraud to bring workers in with a title that isn't really what they do. This is very common. This is a good illustration. Many of the credentials, the resumes, the academics of these H-1Bs are completely fraudulent. For example, Cognizant secures an H-1B contract for a software engineer, but the guy they bring in only knows SQL. Folks, I could teach you basic SQL in a day. The customs service worker reviewing the petition doesn't know anything about IT. SQL sounds fancy to him, so he approves it. And then the employees rent it out to corporations as a contract database administrator for 6 to 12 months at a time. This is a job that any American could be taught to do in a week-long boot camp. Cognizant takes a tiny percentage of every hour the employer works, and over 3 to 6 years, H-1B is good for 3 years and renewable for another 3. The 10 grand Cognizant spent to get the H-1B paid off, plus profit, while the employee's working a $70,000 job that hundreds of thousands of Americans could do. It's a low-margin business model that relies on volume to be profitable, and the theoretical $100,000 a year fee would wipe out those margins. That's why it was so powerful, so important, and so compelling. Look at the monthly cost of an IT developer. US, $9,000. Chinese, $3,000. Vietnamese, $1,000. Indian developer. It's explicitly a labor wage arbitration opportunity, a means of undercutting American workers. As I say, that data exposes that the entire H-1B system is nothing but an exploitative effort to undercut American wages, has nothing to do with attracting the world's best and brightest talent. Actually, I say it's nothing but that. It's more than that, but it's worse than that. The addition is the negative, because the addition is the degradation of our American culture by importing hundreds of thousands of third world migrants who are consuming scarce American resources, housing, healthcare, employment, education, social services, like human locusts, not to mention the chain migration that follows them. And how is it that all these H-1Bs are Indian? 3/4 are Indian. And by the way, that's relatively recent. Speaking of relatively recent, I heard from so many Indians yelling at me all weekend how they built the American IT system. They're responsible for all the good things. You know, H-1B only became law in 1990. 1990. What was America doing between, 1790 and 1990 without all the Indians here? Without all the Indians here to build all these things for us. And by the way, they didn't start coming in vast numbers in 1990. That didn't happen until about 2010. Suddenly, their numbers started skyrocketing. 2010 wasn't that long ago, folks, 15 years ago. Does anybody believe this is an organic explosion of American need for Indian IT expertise? Or does this look like a machinated exploitation of a high-trust American immigration system simply being taken advantage of by American companies, by Indian labor contractors, by the Indian government as part of its exportation of its human bioweapons to Western civilization, and by the Indians themselves, by the way, who I'm personally sympathetic with. I should have made this clear at the front. I have no animus to Indians generally. I wish them nothing but the greatest success in the world. The greatest success they could possibly imagine for themselves and their families, all that. I don't want bad things to happen to Indians. I only want good things to happen to Indians. I just want those things to happen in India. So I understand why Indians want to come to America. If I lived in India, I'd want to come to America too, but that's not the question for an American. The proper question for an American is any of this in America's interest? And I suggest to you that it's not on many levels. This chart, 75% of H-1Bs come from India. Now, you would think you could imagine that the H-1B statute, would have the word India in it. This is a statute intended to focus on India. No, it's available to anyone on the face of the earth. But somehow, 75% of the people come from India. That's crazy. We have a visa category meant for the entire world, And yet, if you say the word H1-B, what's the nation you think of? What's that person look like? They're an Indian. Of course they're an Indian.